The 90s will always be considered an essential period for superhero films, as many of the movies managed to set the tone for how this genre would work. Tim Burton's Batman films would bring in the darker take on the genre. Believe it or not, it did influence Nolan's Dark Knight trilogy. But amid all these films, a few pulp heroes were brought to life, and even though they were reminiscent of a completely different era, they strongly impacted the genre. One of these films was the 1994 Alec Baldwin movie, The Shadow. It's not surprising if you haven't heard of it, but now it's time to put on your fedora and black cape as we go deep into the world of The Shadow and figure out why this film deserves another chance. Before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. The Shadow, a film that no one anticipated. You're accustomed to the plethora of comic book movies that come out every year nowadays, each trying to tweak around and make a completely fresh attempt at bringing these stories to life. However, in the early 90s, the studios were unsure if the genre would work, and they needed one film to test the waters and see if the comic book movies would become a trend. And even after all that, we somehow managed to get films that set the trend for several genres, permanently changed our image, and proved that these characters can exist outside the panels. Several comic book characters were greenlit across studios, and even the directors were sometimes the very people who had been fans of these superheroes, who grabbed the opportunity to bring them to the big screen. The Shadow, with Alec Baldwin as Lamont Cranston, a stylish vigilante with a criminal past, stood out in the wide variety of names that appeared on the big screen. Cranston's redemption tale as The Shadow, pitting him against drug lords in the heavily stylized 1940s New York and a descendant of Genghis Khan, was a unique addition to the superhero film canon. It was the absence of the bright-colored optimism from the times of Superman and the brooding tone of Batman that made this story a unique choice. The amazing cast included the eerily charismatic John Lone, who fit right into the role of Shiwan Khan, as he and the Shadow navigated in a world filled with trench coats and Tommy guns. The hypnotized goons and the nuclear bomb in Manhattan might have been a bit of an overkill, but then Mission Impossible hadn't met multiple attempts at saving the world from a nuclear bomb yet. Don't forget the fact that it also features the damsel in distress side of the 40s noir films, with Penelope Ann Miller's character of Margot Lane, a telepath whose father, Reinhardt, played by a pre-X-Men Ian McKellen, was a nuclear scientist who had succumbed to Khan's control. Tim Curry's Farley Claymore, once again bringing the unhinged menace, made for a character you won't easily forget. Despite the film's stylistic confidence and stellar cast, The Shadow struggled critically and commercially. Still, its practical sets, vintage costuming, and Jerry Goldsmith's sweeping score, all echoing the influence of Danny Elfman's Batman theme, gave it a timeless texture. It remains one of the few attempts to channel the pulp tradition on screen faithfully. One must delve into the comic books and radio series pages to truly understand The Shadow. The character's roots in the variety of media and the love for the genre that led to the creation of his character are key to appreciating its significance in the superhero film genre. The birth of a mysterious hero, from the radio to the comic books. Now, The Shadow wasn't purely created for the comic books. In fact, the creation of this character is a journey that started with what has to be one of the cleverest marketing pivots of all time. Back when the detective story magazine needed a boost in sales, they hired David Chrisman, who used to work in an advertising agency, and writer-director William Sweets to bring the stories from this magazine to life in a whole new format. They decided that the next bunch of their stories should be narrated as a radio series, but not in the usual pattern, because they thought it would be more intriguing to keep the narrator a mystery. Then scriptwriter Harry Ingman Charlotte suggested the name The Shadow for this mysterious narrator with a sinister voice. Funnily enough, the fandom for the magazine shifted towards the mysterious character of The Shadow, and fans started demanding that Shadow Detective magazine, a label that clarified that The Shadow was more successful than they might have imagined. Now the focus has shifted towards The Shadow, and Walter B. Gibson was assigned to write more stories that explored the character under the pen name of Maxwell Grant. The first story was published in 1931, and everything done through these characters established the very tone of the character, which would permanently affect how the fans looked at him. This iconic character, with his black-clad vigilante persona, was not inspired by the Caped Crusader, but but by Bram Stoker's Dracula. The only close resemblance was with the French character Judex, who shared a similar costume. In the 1940s, the Shadow comics were translated into French as The Adventures of Judex. These early influences, along with the character's secret identity, collection of supervillains, and stylized imagery, were established in the original books, shaping how fans perceived him. It became clear that the demand for this character was ever growing. It became clear that even the radio format had to be changed to be more curated towards the character itself. So, an official radio drama would begin, and a 22-year-old kid who would impact the world of cinema forever took on the role of the Shadow's voice for the radio. I am talking about Orson Welles. Yes, the masterful director had taken on the role of this vigilante way before Alec Baldwin was even born. Later, the Shadow would be adapted into a comic strip that would appear in the daily newspaper under the Ledger Syndicate, with the source for the stories being the very first stories that Walter B. Gibson wrote. It would go on till 1942, when it was finally cancelled, and the daily strips were collected together and released as a comic book series in 1988 and then in 1999. But that doesn't mean that the character had a short time in the comic book format, because he would go on to make appearances in some of the major comic books from Archie to DC. It was DC first that would release an atmospheric interpretation of the character through a 12-issue series that was very much faithful to the magazine stories and the radio version of the character. Before Batman, there was the Shadow, the character's black-clad vigilante persona, dual identity, and atmospheric tone directly influenced Bob Kane and Bill Finger, who acknowledged the Shadow as a key inspiration for creating Batman. Finger even stated that his first Batman script was a takeoff on a Shadow story. This connection is later reflected in the comics themselves, where Batman meets the Shadow, who calls him his greatest inspiration. It's hinted that the Shadow once saved young Bruce Wayne's life. The Shadow even knows Batman's identity, but promises to keep it secret. Over the years, the character has made appearances through Marvel Comics too, in narratives that also involved him going against Hitler, to the character being present in modern times. A change from the 1940s setting it was usually given. DC did provide a lot of interest to the character, as they also brought him along for one of the most popular storylines of Kingdom Come, where he appears next to Rorschach and the Question in a nightclub. Even though fans might have only heard of the 1994 film with Alec Baldwin, the character had made several appearances through some short films and even hour-long episodic storylines. The first was a series of short films released from 1931 to 1932, where the Shadow appeared as the narrator, and Universal Pictures distributed them. Eventually, a film titled The Shadow Strikes was released in 1937, featuring Rod LaRocque as the vigilante, and it followed Lamont Granson as he took on the Shadow's mantle in an attempt to thwart a robbery at an attorney's office. The actor would return for the follow-up to this film, International Crime, where he would again take on the vigilante's role, but this time as a radio gimmick. The 1940s would eventually see a 15-chapter movie serial that featured Lamont Cranston being pitted against the Black Tiger, a villain who sabotages the factories and the rail lines. This time, Victory Jory took on the titular role, and his depiction of the Shadow had him wear an all-black suit and a black bandana that helped hide his face. It was late in the 1946 series that we would witness a major change in the character's costume when Monogram Pictures released a couple of Shadow B-movies featuring Kane Richmond in the titular role. This time, he would be seen dropping the black cape with the red lining and the red scarf for a full face mask and trench coat, something quite similar to the one worn by another movie serial hero, the Masked Marvel. Over the years, it became clear that the character had managed to have a sufficient influence in the world of fiction, with multiple characters being inspired by him. Even the masterful author Alan Moore noted that his popular character, V, from the fan-favorite DC Comics series V for Vendetta, had some key influence from the Shadow. Almost every time you feel that the character has a similar tone to another major character in the comic book world or the vigilante world, there's a chance that the Shadow has some major influence. I mean everyone, including the beloved Darkwing Duck. Hitting the 90s feature film stride, The Shadow. Producer Martin Bregman had acquired the rights for The Shadow in 1982, and there were plans to make a feature film immediately with Robert Zemeckis taking the wheel. Sam Raimi was a big fan, and he pitched a story about the character, something he wanted to use as his first superhero film, only to be rejected because the Rob Zemeckis project was under development. Raimi would morph the story into a whole new character that would become a franchise of its own, Darkman. Yep, Darkman resulted from a rejected storyline that was supposed to be dedicated to a feature film adaptation of The Shadow. After years of being stuck in development, David Cope would be brought in to bring the character to life, and as for the director, it would be better if Russell Mulcahy told you how he got to helm the project himself. According to Russell, I had known about The Shadow for several years. More particularly, I have some friends in England who are total addicts and have piles and piles of books and information. I had heard that there was a script going around that they had been trying to get off the ground for years, and with no connection, I did an HBO film with producer Marty Bregman, Blue Ice, and we got along well. During that project, he asked me to do this other film with Kim Basinger, the real McCoy. I knew then that he had The Shadow. I never really pushed it. I said, "The Shadow's a really wonderful character. I can't believe it has never been done before in the movies." And Marty said, "It's going to happen, and I would love you to do it." I guess he had also seen Highlander. At that point, I became very serious about looking back into the material. Russell gained international recognition when he launched the fantasy world of the Highlander with the 1986 film, and it went on to become a franchise of its own. So the production of The Love for the radio shows by David Cope and Russell Mulcahy was supposed to begin soon. Alec Baldwin was cast in the role of the titular character, and it was, in fact, something Cope was pushing for himself, as he would mention. I usually try to avoid thinking of a specific character, because it tends to limit your thinking when you're writing a character in a way that it shouldn't. You're going to have to make changes to suit the actors soon enough anyway, so I figure that the early drafts are the only time that the characters are really yours. But in this case, I've always been a fan of Alec Baldwin, and he just came to mind early on. In addition to being a great actor, he has the eyes and the voice. He had so much of what I pictured Cranston being. And then we were lucky enough to get him, which never happens. You never get your first choice. The film had a lot of anticipation, but since it hadn't hit the film audience in a manner like the popular DC or Marvel characters had at the time, there was a chance that it would prove to be an interesting take on the character, and based on the history that the character had over the decades, David Cope put it best when he said, "Every time the Shadow moved from one medium to another, it changed a little bit. They changed the rules a little bit to suit the radio. The power to cloud men's minds was never in the pulp novels. That came out of how perfectly it fit the medium of radio. So we felt licensed to mutate a little bit ourselves. Truthfully, I think it makes you a little nervous to mess with something people are familiar with. When you change the Coke recipe, it's bound to make you a little nervous. But I think we did a good job. I think people will be pleased." Jerry Goldsmith would work on the film's music, marking his second attempt at going into the superhero genre, with the previous one being for Supergirl. What happened to the film? At a time when multiple superhero franchises were being released into the world, the idea that The Shadow would be brought back with an interesting take and the visual aesthetics into the feature film format felt like a surefire hit. The Shadow was supposed to be a summer blockbuster, and it was also believed to have a new toy line as part of merchandising, along with a game for the Super NES as a tie-in to the film. It was released in the summer, which also had The Lion King set for release, along with The Mask coming on later. And even though The Shadow started at number 2 in the box office, it failed to keep up, and ended up only making double its budget of $40 million. Everything planned along with the film's release, including a franchise and the game, was all dropped, and ended up in the League of the Rocketeer and the Phantom, a league that will be discussed later. The critical and audience response was equally poor, as the director and the writer were blamed for making some bizarre choices in bringing the project to life. Mulcahy later went on to say, "Well, so the film is set in the 1930s, and you have a character, Genghis Khan, who comes back and he's going to make an A-bomb. And one of the great things about that film was that I met and became friends with Ian McKellen, who is the dearest man and such a brilliant actor. But I think the problem with the script was you have this character who wants to blow up 1930s New York with an atomic bomb. And I love fantasy films. That's my passion genre. Thrillers, horrors, but it sort of didn't make sense when I was filming it. Is it that we knew New York didn't blow up in the 1930s with an atomic bomb? So it was weird." And in another interview he mentioned, "I guess the producer had, I think, he had a slightly different vision of the film than I did. So for example, with the knife, I wanted that to come to life and be animated, and there was a bit of a struggle in trying to make the film, maybe, a bit more fantastic. I think he wanted to make more of a 40s retro romantic film, and so we did have some discussions about we should add more fantasy into this film, more effect. We can never pinpoint what went wrong, because some people enjoyed the film and loved how Alec Baldwin fit into the role, along with a fresh take on the origin story, which completely changed a lot of factors. Even though the film would later be added to the lists of some of the worst superhero films ever made, it isn't surprising to say that it has garnered some love from the fans ever since. I think Penelope Ann Miller said it best when she put it as, "You know, it's so hard to tell the rhyme or reason, and why certain movies make it and some don't. A lot of it's timing. A lot of it is how they promote it. I don't know. I think it could have been, I really do. I think it's a fun film to watch, so I don't know why it didn't catch on. It could be a lot of variables that I, unfortunately, don't have any control over." The bold take on the origin story. We cannot point out what went wrong, but the take on changing the origin story is something many people don't do. It was generally avoided to fit the demands of the fans, who were the primary audience. But that had to be done, considering the many changes the character underwent over the years as it shifted from one medium to another, particularly from the radio to the pages of the comic books. The origin story was the one thing that saw the most significant change for this character, and it was surprising considering it was difficult to keep up at times. But if we stick to the most commonly referred to origin story, the Shadow is supposed to be Lamont Cranston, a rich playboy who becomes a vigilante at night. But that was not the original origin story, because the Shadow was supposed to be Kent Allard, a spy who was working during the First World War, and he would eventually end up crashing into the South American jungles while piloting a plane. Here he discovered El Dorado, the city of gold, and made a fortune, only to return home to New York with a completely new identity. This identity is of Lamont Cranston, and yes, Lamont Cranston was a real person who would travel around the world all the time. Whenever such an opportunity came, Kent, who had a physical resemblance to the man, took on the identity. There's a particular storyline where Kent saves Lamont, and to carry out his work, he borrows Lamont's identity and asks him to distance himself from Kent. If you are confused, you should go deeper into his arc, where you would find that Kent didn't just have two identities, but he also took the identity of Henry Arnaud, another person that the Shadow had rescued and bore a resemblance to Kent. Similarly, there was the janitor called Fritz and the criminologist called George Clarendon, and Kent donned these identities whenever he needed. So it isn't surprising when the character was brought in for the comic book runs, all this backstory was chopped off, and these multiple names were completely ignored for a simpler arc. Now, Cope took some liberty and built on the multiple identities arc by bringing in the Ying Ko alias, which has been mentioned in some past runs, but not exactly in the manner that Cope did. Cope did take into consideration that there are some rather interesting similarities between Batman and Shadow. As he had stated, a lot of those superhero stories came out of the same social circumstances in the early 30s, and there certainly were similarities. Most notably, a wealthy bachelor man about town with a dark secret who actually fights crime. The thing too is to find out what the key to yours is and explore that storyline. In Batman, it was revenge. In ours, I decided it was guilt. I was always struck by the copy line, "Who knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men?" and wondered how he knew what evil lurks in the hearts of men. And I decided that perhaps it was because he was uncomfortably familiar with the evil in his own heart. When it became a story of guilt and atonement, in my mind, it became a very different story. While many of the external circumstances, like the mansion in Manhattan and the running around and throwing creepy shadows on things, may be similar to Batman, I think it's a very different story. Focusing on guilt became his primary objective, thus bringing into focus the words, "Who knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men? The Shadow knows," words that had embedded themselves in the American idiom. And just in case someone tells you that Orson Welles dropped these lines, I must tell you that it was, in fact, actor Frank Reddick who said this, and fans will forever remember them. So, Cope introduced Cranston as the original identity of the Shadow, who set himself up as an opium kingpin and brutal warlord in Tibet after the First World War. He picked the name Ying Ko and managed to keep his identity a secret until a mysterious Tulku abducted him and took him to the Temple of the Cobras. Under the captivity of the Tulku, Cranston decides that he will change his ways and also learns how to become invisible by clouding the minds of men. That helped interpret how Cranston used to turn invisible from his early radio days to the times he was first brought into the books. That is an interesting take on the character, considering fans hardly ever like the idea of focusing on their favorite superhero with a changed origin story. The Batman element made sense because Tim Burton had just brought his fresh, dark take on the character. He managed to get everyone's attention back to the superhero films, which had started dying down over the years. In recent years, Only a few directors have attempted this, including when Sam Raimi completely ignored the idea of presenting his Spider-Man with web shooters, which might seem impossible for a teenager to make by himself. This tiny change managed to skim through all the complications regarding the character and his large collection of alternate identities. Some of the Shadow's other names include La Sombra and El Hombre, which somehow go into the Shadow region, except that the later refers to shading. Kaibet, the Vigilante's identity in Egyptian, relates to shadows and souls, which goes deeper into the idea of the character. Ying Ko also followed that pattern, with Ying particularly meaning shadow. Why should you watch it? Today's superhero films dominate screens, with sprawling franchises constantly reimagining iconic characters. But the roots of the cinematic wave stretch back to the early 90s, when Warren Beatty's Dick Tracy aimed to capture comic book style through bold color palettes and expressionist sets. Its lukewarm reception didn't end the experiment, it redirected it. Instead of betting everything on massive properties, studios turned to pulp-era heroes from the 30s and 40s. First came The Rocketeer, 1991, a love letter to wartime adventure serials and vintage Americana. Then followed The Shadow, 1994, and The Phantom, 1996, forming an unofficial trilogy of pulp icons brought to the screen. Though none found major box office success, all three carried a unique commitment to period style, practical effects, and theatrical villainy. Time has been kinder to them than critics were. These films pulse with a sincere affection for the golden age of radio and comics, anchored by rousing orchestral scores. Jerry Goldsmith's work on The Shadow stands out, clearly influenced by Elfman's seminal Batman theme. The result isn't just nostalgia, it's transportive, pulling viewers into a stylized past that feels more tangible than much of today's CG-saturated fare. Marvelous verdict. With Disney floating plans to revive The Rocketeer, pulp heroes might finally be gearing up for a comeback. The Shadow may not have nailed every landing, but it delivered a slick, moody ride that still holds up as a blast of stylized escapism, far from today's franchise fatigue. Its noir visuals, practical effects, and larger-than-life tone give it a texture modern green screen blockbusters lack. Alec Baldwin leans into the mystique as Lamont Cranston, squaring off against Shiwan Khan, the last heir of Genghis, and one seriously underrated villain. Look closer, and the film's packed with clever nods to its roots in old radio dramas and pulp mags, slipping in sly, self-aware touches that reward longtime fans without breaking the spell. And if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one, be safe, and thanks everyone.